Chapter 17. Gary was lying on the floor of a broom cupboard. A blow to the head as he passed the room left it easy for his assailant to catch him and shuffle the last few feet through the door with Gary's limp yet heavy body in his hands. "I'll take that," were the only words Gary heard as the man searched his pockets. Gary was helpless to resist. The throbbing pain in his head worsened every time Gary moved. He wanted to lie there for hours on end, letting the headache subside like he would a hangover. But he knew the fact that he was on the floor of a cupboard in a hospital meant that someone else was in danger. The rest would have to come later. Now he knew how Ash felt. Bringing himself to his knees before attempting the full ascent, Gary pushed the pain to the back of his mind, trying to focus on his warm bed with his partner Agnes looking after him. All he had to do was get up, get out of there, and secure Marcus Bright. Then he could sound the alarm and get some medical attention himself. Gary used his hands to walk their way up the front of his thighs, straightening his body as he did so. Leaning on a shelf that smelled of cleaning chemicals, Gary felt a rush of pain run from his jaw through and out the top of his head. He stumbled forward, catching the door handle as he stumbled. Rattling the door handle confirmed the fear he had that it had been locked. Gary felt trapped, panicking and banging on the door with both fists as loudly as his head could stand. It felt like hours before someone arrived at the other side of the door. "What are you doing in there?" the voice asked. Gary fumbled around in the dark, hoping that he could find a light switch and the light wouldn't be too strong. He pressed the palm of his hand against the walls, hoping that he would get lucky and bump into the light switch. It was actually on the outside of the room. Gary could have spent all night in there and not found it. Suddenly, the light flooded the room, and Gary pulled his left arm across his face. It felt like a 100-watt bulb, the kind his grandfather insisted on in every room when Gary was young. Visiting grandfather felt like it was an inquisition to Gary. Bright lights always shone in his face. The lock shook, and then the door opened, revealing a less harsh light and a figure that didn't look happy at someone in his cleaning cupboard. "I'm sick of you buggers pissing around in there. You're not the first person I've had to remove from this room this week. I blame the stag parties. I'm calling security," the cleaner said in a stern voice, making Gary shield from the noise as much as the light. No need," Gary replied. "There's every need. I want you off the premises." Gary flashed his badge. "Police. I was hit over the head and locked in here. In fact, call security now," Gary replied, changing his instruction. "Make your mind up. Do you want security or not?" the cleaner asked, sounding as confused as Gary felt after the blow to the head. Gary took off in the direction of Marcus Bright's room, with the voice of the cleaner following him along the corridor. As he reached the door of the room, he noticed that it wasn't properly closed. Before that, Gary had witnessed all of the hospital personnel being incredibly careful to ensure that the door was closed whenever they entered or left the room. He kicked the door, not wanting to touch the handle. Gary had a feeling that he needed to keep his hands free. As he opened the door wide and looked inside, the window was open. There was no sign of Marcus Bright. Gary turned around to see the cleaner with a security guard stood behind him. The man was a colossus, standing at around 7 foot tall, looking like he was almost as wide. Not quite all muscle, but a chest and biceps that had been honed by years in the gym. Gary was happy that he had time to explain. He didn't fancy being led from the premises by that guy. Just the slightest nudge would have felled him. "Are you the cop?" the security guard asked, with a voice suitably deep for such a frame. "Yes, that's me. Can I take a look at your CCTV? Please." Gary found some manners at the last second. It wasn't his usual style, but something about this giant of a man brought about Gary's best behavior. "Follow me," was the reply. Gary did what he was told. That didn't happen very often. It was a full 5 minutes before they reached the office with control room written on the door. The man walked ahead, Gary behind. Not a word said between them. "What do you want to see?" the man asked, plonking himself into a chair that bounced down and then up under the weight. "What do you have in the corridor outside the room Marcus Bright was in?" "The room where I first met you," the security guard asked, sounding like it took him ages to grasp the simplest instruction. "Yes, that's the one. What's there? Can you manage that?" Gary asked, increasing in confidence, decreasing in patience. "There's a camera outside of that room. From what time?" "Shall we start with half an hour before we first met?" Gary instructed, using the point of reference that the giant of a man already had. It was easier this way. The pair of them watched the images on the screen in front of them. A man who looked like a bearded version of Marcus Bright paced up and down outside the door, speaking on the phone. After around 10 minutes of talking, the man entered the room. All they could see at that point was shadows moving across the light. Gary's frustration grew. He wanted to be able to maneuver the camera into the room and watch what was going on. Detective work would be so much easier if that was possible, if there were cameras watching every move of every person on the planet. A minute or two later, the man emerged with Marcus, still in a hospital gown. The man had Marcus propped up under his shoulder, moving him along at speed where only one foot was in contact with the ground every few seconds. Gary was reminded of a racehorse, spending more time in the air than in contact with the surface. That was about the only fact that Gary knew about racehorses, save one. The other fact that he could rely on was that if he put his money on the horse, it was bound to lose. "Follow him," Gary instructed. The security guard started to rise from his chair. "No, on the screens," Gary explained, shaking his head at the slow-witted nature of the man that he had to rely on to rescue the day. The man was far more adept with CCTV systems than he was with comprehending the English language, and he followed Marcus and his unknown lookalike all the way from the corridor to the car park. Gary took note of the registration number of the car as the security guard showed the car leaving the hospital grounds and turning right. "Right. Thank you very much for all your help," Gary said, as he rose to his feet. "Wait a minute," the security guard said. "I need to look at the beginning again." Gary didn't stop getting up, thinking that the man wanted to watch again for his own pleasure. As he grabbed his coat and stretched, rubbing his aching head, Gary was stopped in his tracks by the position of the security guard. He had his face pressed up to the glass like a child who hadn't been told by their parent that it wasn't good for their eyes. "The phone isn't on," the security guard exclaimed. "What?" "He looks like he's on the phone, but there's no light from it, no illumination. He's pretending to be on the phone." "Well, that fucks up another possible lead. Thanks for that," Gary replied. The security guard couldn't work out if the detective stood in front of him was being sarcastic or not. Then he decided he didn't care. By the time he sat down again, Detective Gary Hole had left the room.